I'm Brendan Laughlin. I'm the Managing Director of Wella Ventures, which is the division of the Wellington School that works on projects like this. And who will be presenting to you today is John Cruzan. He's our Director of Technology here at the school. Do you want to go ahead, John?
Great. Well, thank you very much, and hopefully you can see my screen here. I'll be presenting a short PowerPoint that will give us sort of an overview of what the Wellington Engagement Index does and how we got where are now. And then we'll switch gears and we'll present a little bit of the actual interface of how the product works from a teacher and administrator viewpoint. And then we'll finish up with a period of time for questions. So hopefully everybody will be able to follow along. And if you have questions, you can type them in your client. And Brendan will be watching those questions and will either answer them at the end, or maybe if it's a really important one, Brendan may interrupt me as I go along. So uh, this is me. I'm the Director of Technology here at Wellington, and I've been in independent school education now for over 25 years. I started off as a nuclear physicist and quickly realized that I'd rather teach about things than do the research myself. So I got into education and have been happy here ever since. So uh, we a few years ago at Wellington decided that this concept of engagement, whether a student is into what they're doing or not, became very critical to our story about making maximizing learning. And we made the basic statement that students learn best when they are, quote, engaged. This is part of a recollection of our time back, thinking back to those moments in your education when you were totally into what you were currently learning. You were in the flow, as some people say, or you were in the zone, or you were studying something and time passed and you kind of came out of it and realized, oh, wow, 2 hours or 4 hours or whatever had just come by. And so in recent time, this idea of student engagement has gotten a little bit more traction in the educational literature and dialogue. And so, what we did is we looked around and we said, um, what is engagement and how do we measure it? And we realized that a lot of people hadn't gone to that part of the question yet. They had said hey, student engagement is good, which we all kind of nodded and smiled and agree. But we felt like it was time for us to try and come up with a way to measure it. So the first part of measuring was to define, and we came to this definition of engagement. Engagement is the intersection between being challenged by what you're doing and loving it. So it's that combination of there is some challenge. You can totally enjoy something that is entertaining, but you're not necessarily fully engaged, fully vested. It's usually a combination of some challenge to you and an enjoyment, a love of what you're attempting to do. Uh, there are certain classes I can think back to in my history where I was the subject was difficult, interesting, convoluted. There were good questions to answer, good things for me to get my mind wrapped around, and I certainly enjoyed and loved what I was doing. So that intersection is our definition of engagement. And from that, we derived a quick little tool that we asked our students to complete. And all we are doing is asking them to rate each of their classes on two axes. The axis of hate it to love it. So, where would you put your experience in this class? Again, we're not unlike a survey where we're asking for lots of multiple dimensions about a class. We're just asking a student to just total gestalt experience of the class. Where would they rate it, and how much do they hate it and love it, and how much unchallenged or challenged is that? Now that rating is going to be a combination of teacher experience, room, pedagogy, curriculum, everything. It's all about the entire experience for the student. But we came from this idea that if you want to find out um, whether the students are engaged or not, we should ask them. We should not try to come up with some other scheme by which to determine whether they're engaged or not. We're simply going to ask them, and this was the way we determined. And then we gave some names to these quadrants, and this helps us get our minds wrapped around what our ratings will be when we get a picture of them in the actual tool. So if we find a rating somewhere in the love it and challenge, we say that intersection leads to engaged. Hating the experience but being highly challenged by it, we've been nicknaming the grind. These are the courses that just seem to go on and on about like problem sets or whatever the thing is that doesn't click with you. It's hard and you're not enjoying it. Um, it's not enjoyable and it's pretty easy. That's the board combination. And then the you really like it, but it's not very challenging. We call that the entertained. And from this, we have decided that what we really want is everything in the engaged quadrant. And if it's not there, we would like to figure out a way to move it towards the engaged quadrant. Here's a picture of how the student interface operates. It's very simple. They use a web-based tool. The advantage of the web-based tool is it's cross-platform, so it'll work on every single device. They can do this on their phones, they can do it on their tablets, their Chromebooks, their iPads, their computers. It doesn't matter. They just need the URL to get connected. Each student will have a unique identifier that is provided by your school in the system. That will allow them to pull up their schedule. So here is an example of a student that would have 5 classes here, and they place it on the engagement grid by simply clicking and clicking. So they select Hero Vehicle Maintenance, and they click in the grid where they believe that particular class belongs. And we call those dots. A lot of times you'll hear me refer to dots. So this Wellington Engagement Index originally was always referred to as dots. So I just go back to that all the time. So the reason is because you actually put dots on the grid. So put these simple dots in the grid. You're only asking these students for 2 pieces of information. Do you love it or hate it? And is it challenging or unchallenging? What could you possibly get out of such a simple tool? And the answer is we can answer a lot of things. We can identify students at risk. We can identify teachers at risk. We can identify excellence both in teachers and students. We can identify better ways to allocate resources. For example, teaching assignments. A lot of times you make them based on some sort of historical choice or some sort of preference by the teacher. We have evidence that says that we can identify that some teachers are better with the remedial courses while others are better with the exceptional courses. And perhaps it would be better to make teaching assignments on strengths as opposed to preference. We can validate change. A teacher has a certain set of dots and they say, I don't, this engagement level isn't high enough for me, so I'm going to try this new activity or this new pedagogy or a new class structure. And they can then collect data and see if that change actually affected this student perception of the course. We have evidence of that in some of our classes, and it's quite effective. We can identify excellence, like we find a certain set of classes that have particularly high engagement data, and we can gather those teachers together and have dialogue about what makes your class so engaging. So we think that the data has actionable pieces. It reveals actionable items to you as a administrator or peer or teacher, etc., in ways that are quick for the students to execute and easy for the person who's doing the analysis to pull apart. So what do you get? You get what we call a constellation. This is an arrangement of dots. So in this particular case, this little example shows a particular student's set of ratings for their classes. If this student it was to have an average in this quadrant, we would say this is a student at risk. They are expressing a hatred of the school experience. They are expressing most of their classes are particularly challenging. This student may be overwhelmed. This student may not be a correct fit for your school. This student is a student at risk of leaving your school. So if managing attrition is a major concern at your school, this is a student you might want to intervene with in a way to provide them additional services or in a way to counsel them to a different school, perhaps. It's all about identifying a student at risk in these cases and then finding a method by which you can intervene. Along those same lines, a lot of times seeing a single instance of the student experience is not as meaningful as seeing how that experience changes over time. So we call this a trajectory, and this particular style of plot, where it shows the average of their rating over time, allows you to see how things change. And if you take, for example, the plot on the left, you can clearly see that as a student, quote, headed in the wrong direction. And because we can easily see these patterns as sort of standouts from the what would be the normal experience, and I don't have one on here of what I would call the normal experience. Just imagine that that orange line just kind of wiggles around in a spot in the engaged quadrant. Those are the kind of students we say they're right where we want them to be, and we don't necessarily dig deeper into that experience. So that student on the left is a student moving in the wrong direction. The student on the right is a student also moving in the wrong direction, but perhaps from a completely different standpoint. One's perhaps overtaxed and disliking the school. Other one loves the school, but maybe we can do some enrichment or some additional things to bring up the challenge level in that student. We can validate change. Teacher on the left, this is an actual live teacher from our school, had this type of engagement. You notice a lot of his students were in the grind, changed around some of his assignments and some of his pedagogy, and moved and collected data the next time and saw it had moved to the experience on the right. The other thing we can do is identify excellence. We picked together some of our top scoring classes and ended up with a realization that when we had this conversation with these top classes and top teachers, that student choice was one of the things that brought out the highest level of student engagement. So these are the kinds of things that we wouldn't have known to go to those particular 3 or 4 teachers and have that conversation without the engagement index. We also have teacher trajectories, very similar to the student trajectories, where we can see how a teacher is on average performing over time. And this is an opportunity to have goal settings and in-service and peer-to-peer sharing. All of these things are ways that can add value to the teacher experience and the teacher support, and don't just think of this as a teacher assessment. It's not just an evaluation tool. It's really a tool to identify strengths and weaknesses for improvement. So what can we do with WEI? We believe that this tool can give you quick, actionable data that you can react to. It's predictive, it's insightful. There's a wide variety of things you can do simply by asking students these 2 very basic questions. How much do you love something, and how challenging is it? And we've been running this at Wellington now for over 3 years, and we've found all of the statements that I make here on this page to be true. We've had a chance to have examples of every one of these pieces in living with this concept of the Wellington Engagement Index now for 3 years. So that's the end of the quick overview. And at this point, I'm going to hop out of PowerPoint, and I'll jump into the actual tool and do just a little bit of poking around and demonstrating it. So while I swap over, bear with me. This is what our administrative piece of the Wellington Engagement Index looks like. So as a school administrator, you would come into an interface like this, and this is where you can dig into your student data. The data is real time, so if the students are currently executing your engagement measurement in, say, well, I'll just give you what we do here. At Wellington, we twice a trimester, so 6 times a year, we ask the students to spend 5 minutes of their advisory period to pull up the engagement and enter their data. It takes seriously about 5 minutes of time, and so out of a total of maximum 30 minutes a year, we get a lot of useful data. That data goes in live, so you can pull up the dashboard later that afternoon and immediately start to see the results from what the students entered earlier that day. The main heart of this system is what we call the dashboard. And so if I jump into the dashboard, I have to make sure that I'm on the right school here in a second. So this grid here in the top left is a plot of the actual dots that are being that are collected. You can have this dot grid aggregated by student, class, teacher, or by none. So if I clicked none, well, here, by student, each one of these dots represents the average results of all the dots entered by that one student. These aggregates are nice for finding outliers. So I might be really interested in student 6674. I'm curious why they're so far left on the Love It list. And the nice thing is all of this data can be drilled into. So if I'm curious about what's going on with 6674, I can simply click on that dot and it will take me into the data that led to that average. So here you can see that overall the student has expressed generally dislike of 3 of their courses. And so you can see how they can arrive at that average. This aggregation also allows for finding the outliers in a visual way of the by class, by teacher, and if I want raw data, if I want to see each individual dot for classes just for browsing purposes, you can click none. Generally, we have found that the aggregated values give you a little bit more useful insight than the raw data. Just if you're collecting thousands and thousands of dots, you're going to get a lot of green. I'll just do it just to give you an example here. And uh, although it's visually appealing and it's kind of artistic usually, really, what does that tell you? It tells you that, hey, a lot of them are in the engaged quadrant. But you know what? You know that exactly from this right-hand donut chart where we can see that 58.1 of all responding dots are in the engaged quadrant. 28 are in the grind, or 20 in the grind. Something like 13 are in the entertained, and 7.5 are in the board. These allow you to set targets. We as a school set an engagement target that we want a certain percentage of all responses in the engaged quadrant, and then we try to make activities and interventions that move us towards the engaged quadrant. You can also see grade level breakdowns for the same kind of thing. So here we have a school that is a 9 through 12 school, and so you can hover over and see that, hey, the highest engaged values are the 11th and 12th grade, and the lowers are the 9th and 10th. This is a quick way of finding grade levels that might be of a challenge and a place to investigate. If we scroll down here a little bit, we see those same values, the Love It and Challenge averages for the school over time. So you can see what happens in a time series. This is our test school. So in a real school, you wouldn't quite see this much variation. But in our test school, we're constantly using this school for evaluation of software changes and things. So there's all sorts of useless, meaningless data in this school. So it tends to be kind of volatile. So that's why you see so many plots in here. But you would see time series that would help you identify whether you're moving in the right direction or wrong direction as a school. Then a little farther down on the interface is this thing called risk ratings. And what we're doing here is we are doing a little bit of math on the data to try and help you find the outliers, the ones that you should intervene with. So if we come back up here and I go back by class, for example, let it refresh here. And you'll see that some of these outliers that are over here, like, ooh, I really don't think this story underscore 2 is in a very good spot. On average, the students are saying that they hate it with a negative 50 value. Well, down here in the risk rating, there's the story 2, and it's in risk category 6. And Brendan will provide you with what those risk categories mean. But generally, low numbers are good and high numbers are bad. So if it's a 6 or 7, it means you're over here in a danger zone. And then you'll see that this strength rating of 48, that corresponds to how far out from the origin you are. So generally, uh, although it's in risk rating category 6, somebody around 22 means you're not too far off from the origin. So do you worry about it or not? That's up to you as an individual school. But if you had a rating in, say, the 60s, that means you're in risk category 4 with a strength of 60. You're fairly far away. These numbers will go up to 200 in the worst case. You'd never be there on average. And this applies for students, teachers, and classes. So it's a quick way of saying, you know what? This teacher on average, 357, is in the risk category 6. That's not good. Maybe I want to go explore what's going on with teacher 357. Or same way with finding students that are at risk. These tables are quick ways for you to find the ones that are in a bad spot. But the nice thing about the tables is I can go to the other end of the table and I can find the students that are in a really great spot. Risk level 0 means they're in a highly engaged position. And if I find fairly large numbers there, these might be the students I want to go talk to about being ambassadors for my school, or finding out something about it for a magazine or a publication, because they may have a really good story to tell. And then down here, the final thing in our dashboard is a movers. This gets to the aspect of perhaps the most significant is who has moved the most. Have they gone way negative or have they gone way positive over the recent period of time? So that these are all ways to help have you make it easy for you to find people that you want to talk to. And then over here on the left-hand side, you'll see there's a filter. So we can take all of the data that we just did. So for example, if we go back to a student overall, and you're interested in the story about females in your school, you could filter this by female and update, and then you'll only get this data aggregated by those that are tagged as gender female. This allows you to do some comparisons. So here in our test school, you'll see that 60% of the results are engaged for the young ladies. So it turns out that we could then compare and see what's the difference between gender or race or socioeconomic class or any kind of filtering we want. History classes versus science classes. You can really begin to drill into a variety of data. So this is our sort of our landing place. The last little bit of reporting that we can do is we can see those same types of things in our lists. So if we explore classes in a list format, this will give us sort of a average data for each class. We can export this as an Excel file if you want to make some different types of graphs, or keep some numbers for historic purposes, etc. This allows you to sort and filter and find things that you want. And then finally, there's the Teacher Explorer. The Teacher Explorer is what the report would look like for a teacher, and the I'm not gonna get what I want, but and so when you come in as a teacher to the report, to the system, instead of having that full, complete access like the administrator would, when you log in with a teacher level security, you come right straight to this report for your own classes. And this is that trajectory we're talking about. This teacher's data clearly shows kind of a wiggle in position here early. As the line gets fatter, it's coming forward in time. So it's wiggling here in position, not too bad, and it moves in a very positive direction and then plummets downward. This is maybe a trajectory of interest. The report will also show you your overall dots for all of your classes, and then it will break down your dots in each of your classes. And then it will give you comparative discipline results. We find this useful. So a math teacher might have low dots and they may immediately claim, oh, seventh graders hate math. And then right here would be the seventh grade, or would it be the math comparison. And if math has a very high engagement and your particular math classes have a very low engagement, it's much harder to make the argument that everyone hates math. And so then it shortcuts some of those conversations. And then you can also get comparative grade level plots for the same idea, to give you some context. And then what will be coming, not necessarily on this report, but from an overall school standpoint, will be this concept of norming. So as we get more and more schools into the index and using it, you will be provided with norming type data that will allow you to know, like, is 60% good? Is 40% bad? And give you some context. So these are basically the tools that allow you to find the students, teachers, and classes that you want to work on. and the burden on the students is very, very minimal. And yet, we have found that that investment of 20 minutes a year from our students has provided extremely actionable data for our organization. We've made lots of improvements, and a couple of those examples, we had a outstanding freshman English class that had really high engagement levels. So it wasn't a school or a class we were concerned with, and yet the teacher was still continuing to strive forward, and he had what was called an engagement grant that we provide, and he engaged a theater company to come in and work with students in developing a production of Shakespeare while they were studying Shakespeare. And so we thought, you know what, this is new. Why don't we go and look at the engagement data to see if we saw a bump in engagement data from that activity. The teacher wasn't planning to improve his engagement data. He was just trying to be the best English teacher he could be. And it turns out that, sure enough, we saw about a 10% increase in his engagement numbers, even though he already had extremely high engagement. We've also been able to find teachers that have traditionally been excellent teachers, and then they start to slide off, and we've been able to have conversations with them, and they've done some self-assessment and gotten right back on their game. We've also been able to identify in our math program a couple of teachers who turned out to have really great strengths with a particular subset of the math students. One teacher excelled with the advanced students, and one teacher excelled with the more remedial classes. And it turns out that we didn't have their assignments set that way, and the data just showed us that why not teach to their strengths. And then in terms of individual students, we've been able to use the dot data to find students that are sort of giving us a message. And at least as from our school, we don't go up to a student and say, hey, your dots are bad. We usually go up to a student, and we maybe have been prompted by bad dots, but we engage them in the same way we would in any other circumstance. We would go up to them and say, hey, can you tell us what's going on with your experience here at Wellington, and just try to pick apart and pull out their story. And it just so happens that dots was the thing that alerted us to that condition. So that's my pitch, and hopefully you can, from that brief overview, see that the data is easy to manipulate, easy for you to find insights, and it's a really, really easy task for the students to do. So I'll stop there, and if Brendan has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Sure, yeah, thanks, John, for giving that presentation for us. So we do have a couple questions now, and if there are any more that come up, feel free to write them down in the chat box there, and we'll do our best to answer them. So our first question, does the Wellington Engagement Index allow you to also see the connection between student responses and their actual grades in the class? So the tool itself does not have functionality for recording grades. We try to make sure that the data is somewhat anonymous so that we can't go in and identify everything there is about a student. We don't claim to be a student information system, but we do have a really easy way of exporting data from the index in the form of Excel files. So what we do here at Wellington is we just export the data from our student information system, export it from the index, combine it, and then do our analysis that way. Second question is just asking, we mentioned that we find our data to be predictive of certain things, and Jenny was wondering exactly what that was. So we've found the data to be predictive in multiple ways. So I've personally run some statistical analyses that show that our engagement data is predictive of student grades. Say that a highly engaged class gets a 90%, like a student in that class will get an A minus. Well, we found that with that being true, if a class is more entertaining, so it's less challenging, but still the students love it, the students get a much better grade than if it was just engaging, which kind of lines up with what we're trying to say, right? They're not going to be learning as much because their grades are so high because they aren't being challenged much. And conversely, if a student's really bored, where they have very low challenge and they really dislike the school, or dislike the class, I should say, they will get much lower grades than if they were entertained, simply because they're not challenged, but they also don't want to try. They've sort of checked out. We've also found that the data is predictive of school-wide climate. We work with a educational consultant in New York, and he uses the Wellington Engagement Index in some schools that he works with. And when we have conversations, I'll say to him, what I see in this data is that the school is really disorganized. Things are far too simple and easy for the students. They're not being well challenged. And this specific discipline of music, for instance, is just totally unchallenging, and it really needs to be improved so that the students can learn more. And just say, that's exactly what I was going to say to you. I mean, everything in this data is exactly what I'm seeing being in the school. So we find the data to be predictive in multiple ways. We're working on finding even more ways, since we are somewhat confident that it is predictive of student attrition, that we can see if disengaged students are going to leave the school at the end of the year or not. We're working on really making that robust, but it's something that's been indicated to us in the data that we're still working on. So John, how many dots need to be collected for a given teacher to have a stable measurement?
Okay, good question. It turns out that as we've looked at data that takes place over time, teachers tend to be fairly stable. Um, the it, the trick is if you have at least five-ish students in a class, we found that that's sort of a cutoff for when the value um, is fairly stable. That's a good word for it. I teach very small classes. I teach classes sometimes in two or three students, and that can be a little bit of a crapshoot. When you only get 3 dots, it's hard to say whether an average is meaningful or not. But most of our mainline classes of 10 plus students, that data is pretty stable. And one of the things that we know, one of the ways we know that is that we have a ninth grade class that is pretty low in our index. I won't talk about specifically which class it is, but a set of ninth graders have expressed with, um, 80 dots 3 times a year, have expressed that this class is in a challenging position. Then the following year, a completely separate set of ninth graders uh, also rate that exact same experience as fairly low. And then a third year in a row, the class gets similar results. That tells me that the measurement is fairly stable with respect to the experience as opposed to the group of kids, because we can actually track also that a particular grade level, when they were seventh graders, then eighth graders, then ninth graders, we can see that they are not necessarily a very pessimistic group that rates everything lowly, or they're a particular optimistic group or whatever. But the types of data tends to correlate very strongly with the classes and curriculum that they're engaged in, as opposed to their personal group. So that's just an example of how stable the data is, and I would say that we've generally found that about 5 dots has a meaningful average and a meaningful constellation. Um, but in general, most classes get significantly more than that.
Sure. Next question is, how many schools are using the index? Right now we're in 12 schools from New York to Kansas. That's independent schools, religious schools, public charters, public districts, rural, urban. So we're in a pretty wide swath of types of schools, and that's 12 at this time. So that's a really good question. So how have your schools rolled this out in a way that feels inspiring and collaborative rather than punitive or highly evaluative?
Okay, that sounds
So
like my question.
yeah,
Okay, so I'm the director of technology, but I've also been a teacher for many years, and I've been here a long time. And uh, you're right. You could start off right off the bat as saying, "Hey, this is going to tell me what's wrong with me, or this is going to be used to get me fired, or whatever." I, as a teacher, when I get this data, the number one thing I look at is I ask myself the question, why wouldn't I want to know what my students are experiencing? That's my job. My job is to make the experience the best I can for my students. So why wouldn't I want to know this? So we generally roll it out sort of from that perspective. This is really useful information to you as a teacher to allow you to make improvements or modifications in your teaching. Um, and that should not be particularly threatening. It should be uplifting that this is data you can use. This is data I've used. I got hammered one semester for my introductory computer science class, and they all hated it. And so I've actually used that data to inspire me to try and make my class better. And so we always start from that standpoint. Uh, Clearly, from an administrator standpoint, this is evaluative. There's no way not to think of this as evaluative. So you don't want to be you don't want to blow smoke in front of people and say, hey, there's no way this can be evaluative. But it all comes from, at least from the way that we use it here. Um, the administrator may set a goal or may talk about one of your independent um, professional development goals around engagement and just use this as a piece of data to demonstrate that you're improving. In our high school, they do peer sharing on dot data, on WE data. So instead of it being an administrator talking to a teacher about the data, you have two teachers that look at each other's data and give each other feedback and ideas about how to improve or what does the data mean to each other. So it's about the culture you build around it, and usually the thing that we've found and we've said to schools is start with the viewpoint of this is meaningful data that will make you a better teacher. Why wouldn't you want it? And most people shake their head and want the buy-in.
Yeah, that's something that I've run into a lot when I'm personally working with schools, and it's always after the data is taken once or twice, I just hear back that, oh, the teachers actually really are glad that they have this information. This is really helpful in just, knowing if they're connecting with their students and what they can do to help improve. Got another really interesting question for you, John. So do you have any way to disentangle the reputation effect that might be rolled into the rating, particularly in a small school with really well-known teachers?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. And I'll just answer no, not really. I mean, there's nothing that's directly in our tool that will allow you to avoid reputation. The thing to remember is when that student is making that selection, it is really a gestalt. So some piece of that is probably reputation of the teacher, but we don't collect right at the beginning of periods. We collect in the middle and near the end. So that teacher has had that student in class now for 6 weeks or so before we collect that first dot. So if the student is still interested in simply answering based on what they knew the teacher about the teacher before experiencing it, there's really not much we can do about it. But having had this teacher for 6 weeks, generally the student's going to respond on the overall aspect of the class. And again, we can't even say that it's about teacher. We could maybe say their dot is bad because they hate the subject or the structure of the curriculum is boring. It's or the the room is dark and dingy and stuff. We don't in this particular tool drill down into the causes of where the dots go. We actually do have some other pieces of research that we do that aspect. But in this particular tool, it's really about kind of raising the red flag and allowing you to find and begin dialogue and questions and research into what's causing the issue, as opposed to identifying specifically what the issue is.
Yeah, or conversely, to find out what is so fantastic about a certain teacher, certain curriculum that we can replicate elsewhere, or have certain teachers meet with others to share strategies or ideas.
Yep.
Um, all right. Well, if I'm not sure if there's any more questions, but it's been really great. A lot of really interesting questions that have really given us a good bit to talk about. Um, I will definitely be sure to follow up with everybody with the slide deck after this presentation. and to see if you have any questions or other thoughts in the next few days. Really appreciate everybody coming by. This has been really great. I'm really glad that you all decided to visit with us. So thank you again. We'll definitely follow up in the next few days with some more information. Have a great day.